Hi everyone, thanks very lot for joining my talk here today. We're going to talk about life-saving drones and why we are not allowed them. And then actually we will talk about how we are allowed them. We'll move on to that. I will apologise for my use of AI-generated imagery. This was me asking AI to generate me a life-saving drone. So I think if you're worried about AI taking your jobs, you should probably not be after seeing an image like this. So I'm Dr Owen McAree, lecturer in Aerospace Engineering at the University of Liverpool. I'll give a bit more background on me as we go through, but I want to start off with a bit of a scenario. So I want you to imagine, I don't know, you've been on a night out or something and you're on your way home, and you're walking down a fairly quiet part of town and you come across somebody who's collapsed. So they're clearly having some kind of medical issue. You're an upstanding citizen, so you get on the phone immediately, call 999, ask for some assistance, and they say, yep, by the sounds of it, this person's definitely having a heart attack. They absolutely need to get a defibrillator and get to hospital and be resuscitated. So the ambulance is dispatched. Again, another AI-generated image here with his cars going in all directions for some reason. But either way, that would be really bad for an ambulance. So this guy's stuck in traffic. He's 20 minutes away. You're onto the call handler. They're talking you through CPR. Great. However, that person needs to be defibrillated right now. 3 to 5 minutes as soon as possible. That ambulance is stuck in traffic. That's why we have these. You might have come across these in numerous public places, public defibrillators, where the 999 handler will give you a code you can type in. You can unlock this thing. It's completely automatic. It tells you how to use it, and it delivers the life-saving or hopefully life-saving shock to keep this person alive while the ambulance is on the way. Fortunately, you're there by yourself. You can't stop doing CPR on this person because that's going to have worse effect. So you can't go off and find one of these things. You're just onto the call handler who's saying, you're just going to have to wait, basically. And so you're waiting, and you're waiting, and you're doing CPR, and you're doing your best you can to try and keep this person alive while the ambulance is on the way. It's a small chance the ambulance never actually turns up. Because in order to try and get to you, that ambulance is rushing through traffic, going as quickly as it can, potentially putting lots of other people at risk, other pedestrians and things. And that's all something we accept because we say, we want these ambulances to get to the people as quickly as possible. So we accept that small risk that this might happen. But for you there doing CPR on that person, that little niggling thought in the back of your mind that this ambulance might have an accident on the way, that's not going to fill you with a lot of confidence. So fortunately, the 999 call handler that you're still on the phone with has just had a bright idea. He says, you know what? We've got some drones. And these drones have demonstrated, there's a lot on the screen there, you don't need to look at the detail, but that we can get there 16 minutes before the ambulance. So that's in 4 minutes' time. Brilliant. That's within that 5-minute window that we need. And this was demonstrated, the other little bit of text you might be able to see there, in 2017. So this is technology we've had for a while now, and it's been demonstrated. It's been shown to work. We know this is technology that we can use. So great. That's an option for you now. The drone takes off, comes directly to you. You can then follow the instructions, give that person a shock, and now they're fine. Now, it's not quite that easy. Obviously, the ambulance would still turn up and take them to hospital, and hopefully it would be a good day for everyone. So the question to the floor, as it were, is given that choice, not that they'd give you the choice, but given that choice on the phone, do you want the drone or do you want to wait 20 minutes for the ambulance that may or may not turn up? Just interested to people think, to drone or not to drone? Would you choose the drone or not? Now, I'm going to guess most people would say, well, yes, obviously, we would choose the drone. Sadly, for everyone that did choose that, you're all going to go to jail now. So I originally gave this talk in a pub, hence why this is the slide that we have here. But yeah, if you decide to use a drone for that use case, that's against the law. You're now going to jail. Great. So I've just brought you all here, brought you to this talk, and I've just told you you're all going to jail. Great. That's brilliant, isn't it? So who am I to say that? What qualifies me to be able to say you're all going to go to jail now for trying to save someone's life? So with that, I'll give you a quick intro to me, and then we'll talk about how we can actually do this somewhat in the future. So as I said, Dr Owen McAree, that's who I am. I'm a lecturer in Aerospace Engineering at the University of Liverpool. Been working on drone technology for about 15 or so years now, and my specialism is on how do you integrate drones into complex environments. And as we'll see, one of the reasons we can't do these sorts of things with drones at the moment, or it's really difficult to do, is because the environment that we're trying to put the drone in, both the air and the ground, quite complex. So we need to make sure that we deal with those issues safely, and that's the area of specialism I work in. Work with some of the biggest drone companies in the world. So everyone's probably thinking Amazon. No, don't work with Amazon. You might not believe this, but one of the biggest drone companies in Europe, at least so they tell me, Network Rail. So they've got 300 odd drones that they use for monitoring infrastructure and all this sort of stuff. And I've done a couple of projects with them, and we'll talk a bit about those later on, actually. But also very much passionate about working for this concept of what we talk about as drones for good. So we all think of the military connotations and things with drones. Yeah, that's important, but no, my work is all focusing on the good things we can do with drones. So one of the companies I've worked with as well, these guys called Ziplines, they've done medical delivery across Africa. So this aircraft flies past, drops a bag of medicine or drops a blood for transfusion or something like that to a remote community that would really struggle to get it otherwise. So that's what we mean when we talk about drones for good. And when I talk about this kind of safe integration into complex airspace, I also fly in this complex airspace, and I'm one of these weird people that prefers to fly upside down rather than the right way up. So not only do I understand the drone technology and stuff from that sort of background, but I also understand some of the complexities that we're trying to, the airspace that we're trying to put these drones into. So it somewhat qualifies me, I think, to talk about this subject that we're going through today. So back to the question. You're all in jail because you wanted to save somebody's life with a drone. Well, why? How did that happen? How did we end up in a situation where we can't use a drone in such an obviously life-saving situation? Well, to start explaining that, let's go back pretty much to when I started with drones, around about 2009, and look at what the laws were. So, it's the law that's going to put you in jail. So let's have a look at what the laws were back in 2009. Now, it was covered by something called the Air Navigation Order. I'm going to show you all of the law here. I don't want anyone to read it, but I just want you to take in the fact that that fits on one page. You can print that out on one page of A4. Not going to go through it in any detail, but I'm going to point out the very first law. So the most important thing with regards to drones is that you're not allowed to drop animals, whether or not attached to a parachute from drones. I like the fact they decided that was the most important thing, the very first law. And it always just makes me imagine something like this, just this poor little animal. He seems quite happy, actually, but being dropped from a drone with a parachute. Or if anyone's ever studied, I think it's Advanced Mathematics or Advanced Physics or something like that, there's a really famous textbook that has this image in it of a well-prepared cat. I don't know what it was prepared for, but it's clearly come with a parachute, so all is good. Anyway, the main purpose of this is just to demonstrate that the law used to be on one page, fairly easy to understand, fairly easy to digest, fairly easy to understand when you can or can't do something. So we'll just go through a bit of a sort of flow chart now to try and understand what can we and can we not do with drones in 2009. So, any point in time, can you fly your drone? Well, is it over 20 kilograms? If it is over 20 kilograms, it counts as a full-size aircraft. So if you want to go and fly that, you better have a lot of money, because it's the same as trying to invent a new airliner or something like that. So that's probably not something you can do. If it's over 7 kilograms, well, now you've got the question of, are you flying anywhere near an airport? And if you are, you better have their permission. So if you can stay away from airports, you can fly an aircraft over 7 kilograms, no problem at all. Or if you're under 7 kilograms, now this restriction doesn't even apply. Does the aircraft have a camera on it? If it does have a camera on it, stay away from people. This was kind of the simplistic law that dealt with privacy, basically saying if you've got a camera on the aircraft, just stay away from people. Again, unless you've got their permission. So if somebody wants you to film them with a drone, great, get their permission, you can do that. Now, this is where it gets a bit tricky. Are you doing this commercially? Is somebody paying you to do this? So you could say, well, an emergency use case, no. But there were people that wanted to do commercial flights and get paid to fly their drone. Well, in that case, sorry, but you're going to jail. That's illegal. Or you could ask the Civil Aviation Authority very nicely, and they might let you do it. So if you can satisfy all of these things, so either have lots of money or just stay away from airports and people and don't charge anyone any money, well, now you can go fly your drone. Great. There's some other laws in there you need to worry about, which basically says don't be an idiot. So don't deliberately endanger people or endanger aircraft or anything like that. But basically, yeah, those are the rules. And you can pretty much follow that flowchart and decide, actually, yeah, for non-commercial, for emergency services, we can probably fly the drone. Great. Unfortunately, it's not 2009. And back in 2009, the technology wasn't very good. So there weren't a lot of laws because there weren't a lot of drones. So they didn't need to be. Now anyone can have a drone, anyone can go to the shops and buy one, etc. So the laws have had to keep up, but it causes some problems. So fast forward to the latest set of legislation, which came in 2019. And I showed you previously, it was on one page. This is what the legislation looks like today, or the title page anyway. I'm guessing no one can really see any problems with that so far, other than it's got a confusing name, but anyone see the problem yet? Well, maybe. It's currently 402 pages, and that doesn't include references. So it references lots of other documents. So we've gone from 1 page to 402 pages. So even understanding whether or not you can do a drone flight legally has now got exponentially more complicated, as we'll see. So we now ask the question of, well, can I fly my drone? Previously, we had quite a few simple steps to go through. Now we got something like that, and the process basically goes, you fill in a lot of paperwork, you pay some money for somebody expert to look at that paperwork for you, you wait a while, around about 6 weeks, then they probably want you to fill in some more paperwork, then pay some more money, then you wait an indeterminate length of time, and then probably go to jail, because they probably still come back and say, no, you can't do that. It's too confusing. It's too complicated. So even ignoring the jail part at the end there, you can see that if we're trying to save someone's life with a defibrillator drone, well, waiting 6 weeks plus an indeterminate length of months, that's probably not feasible. So we're already starting to see this can be problematic to use drones under modern legislation. But you might also be able to see on this very confusing slide that up in the top left, where it says, can I fly my drone? There's one box where if you can satisfy that box, then you can go fly your drone. So great, why don't we just do that? Why don't we just satisfy whatever's in that mystery box? And if there are any drone pilots watching, you're probably going to know what this is. If you satisfy whatever's in that mystery box, then you can go fly your drone. Brilliant. So what's in the box? VLOS, VLOS. That stands for Visual Line of Sight. So basically, can you see your drone? If you are a person on the ground with a controller for that drone, can you see the drone in an unobstructed fashion? So these little cartoon trees here are showing you where you would not be allowed to fly your drone because you would not be able to see it under visual line of sight. Or in words, I've highlighted the main ones there, you have to be able to maintain continuous unaided visual contact for the purposes of avoiding other aircraft, people and obstacles. That's what the legislation says, but there's also a little add-on to that, which is in the mind of the regulator, they also think you shouldn't be flying more than 500 meters away. So the law doesn't explicitly say that, but that's what the permission that you get to operate will probably tell you. So we now need to keep our drone within visual line of sight of a pilot and not more than 500 meters away. Okay, so can we do VLOS defibrillators? Well, here's central Liverpool with some circles on to say what we would need to do in order to be able to have defibrillators within 500 meters of a pilot. So now we've got 16 stations, but the pilot needs to be able to physically see the patient. So could you see someone 500 meters away who's probably behind a building, behind a tree? Probably not. So that's already a very, very simplistic view. They obviously all need to be manned 24/7 because you don't know when people are going to have heart attacks. So assuming we've got 8-hour shifts, we need 64 pilots just to man 16 defibrillators in Liverpool. At that point, it's probably easier to just use an ambulance and not have 64 people sitting on rooftops waiting to respond to an event that's hopefully quite rare. So why do we have this restriction? Why is that the only way we can go and fly drones? Well, what it comes down to is risk. So you probably saw in the definition of VLOS there that what we're worried about is impacting other aircraft or impacting people on the ground. And those broadly come into these categories of what we talk about as being air risk and ground risk. Now, you might think these things are really unlikely, and they are unlikely to happen, but we still don't want them to happen. We still have to do everything we can to try and avoid these risks. And one of the ways that we do that is actually test. So test what would happen if a drone does hit an airplane, or what would happen if a drone does hit somebody on the ground. And these lead to some quite funny animations. So with an air risk, we're looking at what's the chance that a drone crashes into an aircraft. And then ultimately, if it does crash into another aircraft, what's the consequence going to be? And with ground risk, we're looking at not just does the drone hit somebody, but does it actually result in a fatality? Those are the things we need to try and avoid. So those are the things we need to understand better in order to be able to work out whether it's going to be a risk for us. So here's some testing that was done in the US to determine whether or not a drone would cause significant damage to an aircraft. You can see it does cause a bit of damage. That plane would probably keep flying okay, as long as that didn't then cause a fire, but it's still something we absolutely want to avoid. And this is one of my favourite animations in the world of drones. This is what happens when the drone hits someone on the ground who's just lazing in a beach chair, not really paying too much attention to what's going on around them, and then they get smacked in the face by a drone. So these are tests that people are doing to work out, well, if the drone does hit you, what's the chance it's going to cause any kind of significant injury? And these are the things we need to understand, because when you're flying within visual line of sight, you should be able to see if this is going to happen and then hopefully avoid that happening. That's a term that we use a lot, this concept of see and avoid. Be able to see that something is going to happen and then avoid it. Maybe in that instance, if you've lost control of the drone, you can just shout at the person, hey, get out of the way. But that's the whole idea of why we're restricted to visual line of sight. And these things do happen. So we've had drones collide with firefighting aircraft. We've had a poor toddler who lost an eye from being hit in the face by a drone. Fortunately, we've not had any major fatality incidents or anything like that, but we've had quite a lot of injuries, which of course is something we do want to avoid. So you can kind of understand why we have these restrictions in place. So we've got a bit of a background on the legislation and why we are where we are now. So I'm just going to completely divert the subject for a moment and start talking about trains. We've probably all gotten on a train at some point. If we've gotten on a train in the UK, we've probably also all been delayed at some point. We know that's just sort of a common thing that happens here. One of the big causes for delays is actually trespass. So again, don't need to read all the detail on this slide, but just note that, it's a relatively modern piece of information that's come out from the British Transport Police saying that trespass is a big problem that they have over the summer. And they have sort of 19,000 incidents of this a year. So you can imagine if somebody's reported trespassers on the railway line, well, you've got to stop all the trains now. You've got to get the police there to deal with that event. And that's a real problem, and that's what causes lots of delays for us. So the question then is, well, can we use a drone to help us in this instance? And the reason I'm talking about this is because I've not actually done any work myself with flying defibrillators. Showed you a news article there, loads of people are doing that, but it's not something that I've got much experience with. Whereas drones and trespass, I do have a bit of experience with. So let's have a bit of a talk about this now. Can we use a drone for this? And actually, yes, we can. And this is because there is this nice little bit of the legislation, one of those 400 pages, that gives us something referred to as the state aircraft exemption. And again, I'm highlighting the main points here that basically says those 400 pages don't apply when you're carrying out police activities undertaken in the public interest. So I think anyone would agree that trying to protect people from getting hit by trains is absolutely being undertaken in the public interest. And if it's the British Transport Police doing that, they get to ignore all those 400 pages. But what they don't get to do is ignore the risks. So now it's no longer the Civil Aviation Authority's problem whether or not the police are flying safely, because they're flying outside of the legislation. It's now entirely the police's problem to make sure that this doesn't happen. However, they also now get to consider something that the Aviation Authority does not get to consider, which is, what's the risk of doing nothing? And in this instance here, that is, what's the risk of us not using a drone? So if there's somebody, it might be, it might just be kids messing about. It could be a vulnerable person who's gotten lost and is now walking down the railway line or something like that. So we stop all the trains, great. Then we've got to get the police there, putting the police at risk because you're putting them onto the railway lines. And it might be that that person has just wandered off and is no longer at risk on the railway line, and we can all go back to normal and it's fine, and we can apprehend them somewhere else and get them any help they might need. Because what we want to make sure is that this isn't the case, that we don't have trains running through situations. And these are, I think the one on the right there, the one on the left, I think that's taken from a train. So, we don't want to have these incidents where we've got people on railway lines at risk that we could have. Obviously, you can't rescue them with a drone. We're not flying drones out that are going to pick people up and fly off with them. But we can at least gain the awareness of, are there people at risk? Can we run the trains? Do we have to stop everything, etc.? So we can use drones to assist. And what the police are allowed to do is to say, well, okay, there is a tiny risk we might hit an aeroplane or we might impact somebody on the ground, but there's a significant risk of someone being hit by a train if we don't use the drone to help with this incident. So we can make that informed judgment. The challenge is, how do you make that informed judgment? How do you know what the chance of hitting another airplane is or the chance of impacting somebody on the ground? And this is where a lot of my work comes in. Now, fortunately, when we talk about railway lines, and when we talk about ground risk, the starting point for everything with ground risk is, are we going to hit somebody on the ground? So we start off by saying, well, where are there people? So we look at, for example, population density across the UK. But then you can get hyper-local with this as well and say, well, railway lines don't really have people on. The only people there are going to be the ones trespassing, or people working on the railway line who have protective equipment on, so they're a bit safer if they do get hit by a drone. So actually, if we're flying over the railway line, the ground risk is fairly low. And even if we do hit a train, trains are big, drones are small, the train's going to win. You might crack a windscreen, but you're very unlikely to kill anybody. And in the worst case scenario, that's what we're talking about here. What are the worst case scenarios? We're very unlikely to kill anybody on the railway line with a drone. So really, ground risk, not a big problem for us. Air risk, however, unfortunately, helicopters fly everywhere. This is an example of an air ambulance. Can't remember exactly where it was landing, but they fly wherever they need to fly for, medical reasons, as do police helicopters, as do helicopters that survey power lines, for example. So it's not so easy to just turn around and say, there's no aeroplanes around and so we can fly our drone, particularly if we're wanting to do this in an instance where there isn't the pilot there. So this is again where this visual line of sight restriction comes in. You can say if you're standing somewhere that there's no planes around, and then you can go and fly your drone, and if a plane appears, you can get out of the way. But what if you're not there? And we'll sort of end with an example of how the British Transport Police are doing this now, where you'll see that they don't have a pilot on site. Because if they did have a pilot there, well, that's the police officer. They can then go and deal with the incident. This is all about how can we use the drone before the police officers even manage to get on scene. So how do we go about understanding this? How do we go about avoiding causing an issue to these aircraft? Well, fortunately, a lot of aircraft broadcast lots of different radio signals. And these are just some examples of a bunch of equipment that I've been building. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but these are basically equipment that can receive information from aircraft, a bit like you might have experience with things like Flight Radar 24 and things like this, where you can see where planes are flying, but they don't work very well at low altitudes because the signals don't travel well through buildings and things like this. So this is kind of just a really localized, the sort of top right image you can see there is just a really localized version of Flight Radar 24 that shows you what's flying really close around you. And this lets you generate a huge amount of data. So good luck to anyone who's going to try and read what that says, but this is just to demonstrate. I tried to make this actually a scrolling animation, but I had all sorts of problems with that. It's like the Matrix, just scrolling data, scrolling past constantly, telling you about all the aircraft in the vicinity. And then what you can do with that is you can turn that into some statistics. So this is just an example of one of the sites where we do some work. And this is, I think, 6 or 7 months worth of air traffic data looking at where are the other aircraft flying in the area. And what we're trying to work out here, and again, I'm not going to go into the details of this because it's a bit complex, but what we're trying to work out here is at what heights can we fly our drone? And it turns out if you fly the drone quite low, which is what you want to do anyway, because you're trying to find somebody near the railway line. You don't want to be up in, the upper airspace, in the upper atmosphere. So if you fly your drone quite low, the risk of there being another aircraft there is quite small. And we can evidence that that risk is below the same sorts of level of safety that commercial aircraft achieve. So we can say, actually, this is safe enough for us to do this work. But we can only say that after having done all of this analysis and generated all this data and done all of this. So how does your poor police officer who now wants to use a drone, while he's in his car on the way to respond to the incident, 10, 15, 20 minutes away, he wants to launch a drone so that he can get situational awareness and see what's going on before they arrive. How can they decide if it's safe to do that? And the answer, at least as I propose it, is all about automation. So it's all about how do you use technology? How do you use computer systems, things like AI and stuff like that? How do you use that to crunch all these numbers, put all of this data together, and just generate a yes-no? Safe to fly drone, not safe to fly drone. So that the police officer can just get a big green light and say, yes, go, launch the drone. Now, slightly comical distraction now, but let's just look at autonomy in aviation, this concept of, this was something that came about, I think, in the 1980s when they started putting computers on aircraft. It was referred to as the cockpit of the future. And it's all about how do you introduce autonomy into a system that by necessity still has people involved. In this instance, it would be your police officer. But this is I'm just going to go through the cockpit of the future as it was described in the 1980s. So the concept, if you imagine a commercial aircraft now, that people came up with in the 1980s was that in the future, you would have a pilot in the cockpit. Nobody's saying you're going to get rid of the pilot. These are complex things. You always need somebody there. But alongside the pilot, you wouldn't have another pilot. What you'd have is a dog. And the way that the saying went was that the pilot's job is to feed the dog. got to keep the dog happy on a 20-hour flight or whatever it is. And the dog's job is to bite the pilot if he tries to touch anything. Because the idea is that this is an automated system. You need a human there to keep people happy, but you don't want the human pressing the buttons because it's an automated system. Let the aircraft do the job. Problem is, as we've seen actually in quite recent history, that when one pilot in this instance went to the toilet and got locked out of the cockpit, the pilot that was left fainted, and the aircraft basically flew itself for 10 minutes. And nobody knew about this at the time, fortunately, because the guy came around and managed to let the pilot back in, and everything was fine. But this is kind of an explanation as to why you don't just have one pilot in the cockpit, because in that instance, the dog would not be a lot of use. I mean, yeah, if you've just fallen asleep, the dog might wake you up. But if you've had some kind of medical incident or something like that, you want another person there. But when we're talking about drones, that's actually less of a worry, because if you imagine now the cockpit of the future being on the ground, you got your, okay, still an airline pilot there, but that could be a police officer with just his little pet dog now. Dog doesn't have to shout at him anymore. Because if that guy did have any kind of incident, well, you're in an office block somewhere, you could have backup staff, you could have people, that can come in and just make sure that everything's still functioning correctly. And that computer system then in the background, that's what can be doing all of that complex analysis for you and saying, yes, you can fly a drone over here, but you can't go over there because there's a festival going on in that field. And so if you did have an accident, you were going to put a lot of people at risk. The online system can do this analysis for you and just let the police officer focus on doing the police task, i.e. solving the trespass incident. And this is a piece of work that I've been involved in for a while now. So not that long ago, no, there's not a date on this, but a few months ago, the British Transport Police launched their first, what they call drone in a box capability. So these are drones situated in little weatherproof containers at rail yards, train stations, those sorts of things. And they are piloted from a command centre in London. So that box there, I think, is up in the north somewhere. I think it might be Leeds. And it's piloted from, except for a dog, pretty much the same scenario that I just showed there. Lots of screens showing lots of data analysis that ultimately just says, is it safe to fly or not in this region? And this kind of capability has already been used to crack down on trespass on the railway using all sorts of fancy onboard capabilities like thermal imagery and this sort of stuff. So we've gone through a lot there, but to answer the question, and with the terrible AI-generated imagery there, yes, we can save people's lives with drones, but it's not quite as straightforward as you might think. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions which I will field. Thank you very much.